Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jeff Mieleff. I'm a program manager in the Office 365 customer experience team. And in my role, I actually work in a lot of different areas. I've been working on Exchange with Exchange for the last 15 years. I'm the person behind Ask the Perf Guy, the series of blog articles on the Exchange team blog. I'm the guy behind the performance and scalability guidance for Exchange for the last few releases. The author of LoadGen, sorry. One of the things that I've gotten the pleasure of spending some time on over the last, it's been over a year now, is figuring out what our best practices and guidance is going to be around deploying Exchange on infrastructure as a service providers. And that's really what we're going to start talking about today. Now, by no means is this session going to be a complete, in-depth, deep dive into what those best practices are. But hopefully you're going to walk away with a good understanding of what Microsoft's guidance is in this area in terms of Exchange deployment on IaaS, what we mean when we're talking about IaaS, and what some of your options are in this space in a supportable way. I'm definitely going to spend some time talking about supportability. That's a very important point when it comes to Exchange with these types of deployments. So we'll talk about where the lines are and how to avoid crossing them. So during the session today, and I suspect I'm going to have plenty of time to get through the content. I also have a couple of quick demos to show. So we'll leave, I'm going to try and leave questions until the end just to make absolutely sure that I get time for all my demos. We should have plenty of time for questions, though. We're going to start off with some basics. I have literally 2 slides just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about around IaaS. We'll talk about supportability, what is and is not okay from a Microsoft perspective if you run into issues. And we'll talk about what it means if you go outside of those supportability boundaries, what you can expect and what those risks look like. We'll talk about whether or not this makes sense. That may be a very interesting part of the conversation for many of you. Certainly something we've spent a lot of time internally thinking about. And I want to make sure that we're very, very clear in that aspect of the guidance. And then we'll talk through planning. That's actually the bulk of this session, talking through some best practices around how to think about having a successful deployment of Exchange on this type of solution. So starting off with the basics. What is IaaS? Well, infrastructure as a service, obviously. IaaS can come in different flavors. What we're really talking about here is IaaS that you're procuring from a service like Azure, service like AWS, Google Cloud Platform. There are a number of providers in this space that are all heads down competing very, very intently with each other right now. Most of what we're going to be talking about today will refer to Azure, and we'll refer to features in Azure. If some of you are interested in other platforms, well, that's an option. We'd certainly love it if you'd look at Azure instead. But if you're in that space, you'll find that there are a lot of competitive features from the other providers in this space that have similar, meet similar requirements. And so the guidance will be transferable in many cases. There's also other more traditional forms of IaaS out there as well, right? You can go and rent a server in a rack from somebody and deploy on physical hardware, no virtualization involved, co-located servers. People have been doing that for a very, very, very long time. It's an easy way to get into a data center if you don't have your own, and take advantage of that managed infrastructure. That's also IaaS, but that's not really what we're talking about here. There's also more traditional hosters that may offer some form of virtual machines or even a pre-configured Exchange VM that they're hosting with. That's also not really what we're talking about today. This is much more about procuring VMs, basically Windows VMs, from one of these major providers and using those for Exchange. When we've talked to customers about why they're interested in IaaS, because frankly, it doesn't really align well with our thinking in the Exchange team when we think about our preferred architecture and the way we would like people to deploy, we typically get some interesting responses back in terms of what people are interested in getting out of IaaS. Capacity on demand, right? I want to be able to spin up new servers quickly, take advantage of that capacity when I need it, and if I don't need it, I want to be able to spin it down and not pay for it. That's actually a great reason. However, when you think about sizing for Exchange and building out an Exchange deployment, how many people actually do that? Right? Usually you size for your deployment for the next year, 2 years, 5 years. Maybe you're going to do some thin provisioning with storage or plan on adding storage as you need it. But in general, we find that most Exchange customers aren't adding new Exchange servers on an ongoing basis. So it may be true that there are some in the Exchange admin space that need to be able to do this. But when we've kind of had a dialogue about that with many customers, we typically learn that this is not really advantageous from a production Exchange perspective. Now, for dev test, that's a whole other story. If you just want to kick the tires on something, and we'll talk more about that, totally makes sense. There certainly are desires to outsource many things in the IT world, right? And being able to outsource infrastructure, servers, network, power, cooling, data center space, that's also very desirable, and that's hard to argue with. Bringing up additional sites with minimal investment. It's really expensive to go build a data center. Trust me, we do it regularly. We have some pretty good visibility into how much it costs to bring a new data center online. And if you need one in order to do DR and site resilience for Exchange, that's a very spendy proposition just to be able to add some functionality to your Exchange deployment. But if you could take advantage of someone else's site that's different from your existing production site, well, that starts to sound a little more interesting and maybe more reasonable from a cost perspective. Of course, cloud is cool. I'll leave that one where it is. And then cost savings. Make sure that when you think about cost savings that you're going in eyes wide open. We still believe that even though you can spin VMs up and down, that you're paying for use for these services, that the most, how can I put this? Well, I'll put it the simplest. The cheapest way to deploy Exchange when it comes to dollars per mailbox and dollars per gig of mailbox data is going to be the way we recommend doing it in the preferred architecture. And frankly, that's the reason we deploy that way for Exchange Online. Right? When you're running at that level of scale, you have to make very certain that costs are extremely low per mailbox and per gigabyte of data stored. So look hard at the costs associated with this versus alternatives. So we're going to talk about some specific scenarios in more detail, and I've got them listed here, so I'm not going to go through them now. But these are kind of the scenarios that people bring up commonly when we talk about IaaS. So let's go into supportability. This is my supportability cop. Ross and a number of us had some fun with some of the new approved presentation graphics that we have internally. So yeah, I apologize, but you'll see some graphics that may or may not make sense on these slides. We just had a little bit of fun. So this is my friend, the supportability cop. So we've had some concerns about supportability for this scenario for quite a while. Probably the biggest being we don't use it internally. So we don't really have visibility into potential problems that might show up. We're very hesitant to support things that we don't test with regularly on an ongoing basis. We want to avoid changes in either the platform or Exchange regressing in ways that we don't have visibility into. So if we're not actively deploying on Azure, as an example, we're going to be hesitant to support it. The hypervisor may not be supported, and we'll talk about a specific case of this in a minute. But Exchange has a fairly long history of virtualization supportability guidance and being very specific about a set of hypervisors that we support that provide a basic acceptable level of compatibility and performance to Windows and to Exchange that allow us to support those. It's possible, in some cases, that an IaaS provider may actually not be running a supported hypervisor. And that is a very good reason for us to not support that, that type of deployment. We've also found cases where we run into storage performance issues. We'll spend a fair amount of time today talking about storage performance. This is actually a really key issue for Exchange. Yeah, we've spent the last, well, how many releases have we been doing it? I guess since Exchange 2003, we've been extremely focused on bringing our IOPS down and trying to basically make it less and less important to have extremely fast disks behind Exchange. However, we still care about latency. Right? When you think about storage sizing, you think about capacity, you think about IOPS, and you have to think about latency as well. When you're connecting storage over a network to VMs, latency comes into play in a big way. So we've run into cases with certain IaaS providers where we haven't been able to provide supportability because of latency issues. And then we also have concerns about outbound mail, and I'll talk about that in some detail as well. But the concern there is that with a hosting provider that's just providing virtual machines to anyone, if you're using outbound, if you're using the public-facing IP space from such a provider, you have no way to control the reputation of those IP addresses. They could be used for anything, right? Including a spammer bringing up an application that's going to generate bulk email. And that can result in those IPs getting listed on block lists. So there are a number of potential issues around that. We'll talk about some potential solutions to that a little bit later on. It is important to mention here that we're going to talk about some specific supportability around IaaS in a moment. All the other supportability requirements for Exchange still have to be met, right? We have a minimum RAM requirement, right? We have specific details around the type of storage that has to sit behind Exchange. We talked about hypervisors. All of that library of requirements that exists out on TechNet still has to be met. And that may require some work for you to go sit down with your IaaS provider and actually make sure they're giving you what you need. But if you can actually get past that big checklist of things, then technically your deployment will be supportable. So that's where we are with supportability for IaaS. So on TechNet, we do have a comment out there today that says, I'm trying to remember the exact text of it, something along the lines of deployment on Azure virtual machines is not supported unless you're using an Azure virtual machine as a file share witness in a third site, with a stretch DAG. We're changing that. So I'm going to announce a little bit of Azure love today. So as of today, and actually the virtualization supportability statement, which is where that text lives, that was updated this morning. So what we're supporting with Azure specifically, number one, this was obviously already supported, non-production use of Exchange on Azure, dev test. I'll talk about what that means in a second. The cluster witness deployment scenario that we'll also cover in a little more detail in a few minutes. So that's using Azure as a third site to enable essentially automatic site failover in a DR scenario, and production. So this is the big change. Now, the specific requirement here is Azure Premium Storage, and this is what's actually the reason behind the timing. Did I hear somebody clap? Awesome, all right. Cool. We actually have some excitement, excellent. So Azure Premium Storage went general availability, believe it was tax day, April 15th or 16th, day after tax day. So it has been in general availability for a couple of weeks now. And that is actually the last remaining thing that we were waiting for from a platform perspective from Azure in order to be able to make the supportability change. Now, I mentioned that we've been driving down our IOPS requirements for years. And if you go look at the number of IOPS that Azure Premium Storage can give you, it's ridiculous. It's mind-boggling. We don't need the IOPS, What we need is the latency to come down. And Azure Premium Storage gives us meets the bar for Exchange for latency. What you'll find, if you're like me and you like to spend hours on the weekends running jet stress tests on Azure VMs just for fun, anybody else like to do that? All right, I'm weird. What you'll find is that if you go out and just use the standard storage offering in Azure, you'll occasionally get some jet stress tests to pass, but not reliably. And the issue will almost certainly be latency. With premium storage, I've run many, many hundreds of these tests in different regions and have yet to run into a problem, and I don't expect to run into a problem based on the architecture of the solution. So the specific supportability statement, or the supportability requirement for premium storage, is around Exchange databases and logs. So anything that the easy storage engine is going to be accessing has to be on premium storage. Now, I'll go ahead and throw this out there as a best practice. Just use premium storage for all your disks, right? The only other disk most likely that you're going to have is your OS drive that you're also going to install Exchange on, that you're also going to use for your transport database, because that's aligned with our preferred architecture. So, if you're really trying hard to save money, yeah, you could deploy that OS drive on a non-premium storage disk, but then you'll have to move your transport database, because that is a jet database, to a disk that's actually backed by premium storage. So keep that in mind. In terms of licensing, I'm not a licensing guy. I'm a developer. I don't have to care about licensing. It's kind of nice sometimes. But I know that many of you have to care about licensing. Just be aware that when you think about running Exchange on Azure or other IaaS providers, support for that from a licensing perspective comes through licensing mobility through software assurance. If you're interested in understanding exactly where the lines are, what your options are there, check out these links. I'm absolutely not the right person to explain that in detail, but wanted to call those out just in case you need that information if you're considering doing this. So I do want to mention AWS supportability. And this is a question that I get really often. Is deployment of Exchange on AWS supported? And the answer is, from a Microsoft perspective, no. And there's a very clear reason for it. Amazon doesn't run a supported hypervisor. And there's not really much of an argument against that. The list of supported hypervisors for Exchange comes from the Server Virtualization Validation Program. This is what we've been using since Exchange 2007. It's a program that the Windows team runs in order to, I won't say certify, but in order to sort of bless a set of hypervisors as providing the right set of services and performance and reliability to Exchange that we can confidently run on top of them. The hypervisor that AWS is running is not on the SVVP list. Now, having said that, the SVVP program doesn't really apply to a provider like Amazon, so it's not surprising that their hypervisor isn't listed there. But the key thing to remember here is there's been no testing whatsoever on our part of Exchange running on that solution, which is why we can't directly support it. That's the key point there. We don't currently have any plans to change that. This is not a competitive discussion. This is a investment discussion. We are spending our resources in different ways, and we don't expect to make any changes here in the foreseeable future. So, what does this mean if you're running Exchange on AWS? Who is running Exchange on AWS? I know some of you are. I will give you a t-shirt if you raise your hand. Really? A t-shirt isn't enough of an incentive to get called out? Sorry? Sorry? OpenStack? Oh, okay, well, another unsupported solution. So here, you get a t-shirt. So what does this mean? You can absolutely call Microsoft for your Exchange issue, right? You can absolutely call us. We will absolutely do our best to solve your problem. The key thing to be aware of is that we reserve the right to come back to you and say, well, we've done everything commercially reasonable to solve your problem. But in order to proceed, in order to move forward on the case, we need you to repro the issue on a fully supported platform. Now, I'm personally not aware of this happening in the virtualization space in general. Anybody from support here who is aware? Tim, are you aware of us ever actually doing that? Actually asking a customer to repro on a supported topology?
It's not out of the realm of possibility. I cannot come up with a specific.
Yeah. So the answer there was it's not out of the realm of possibility, but no specific examples. So it's essentially a risk that if you run into a really bad issue where you need support from Microsoft, maybe you need a hot fix from the product group, that in order to actually get that, you might actually have to do an additional deployment on a fully supported platform, reproduce the issue if you're able to, and then proceed. Not a great place to be when you think about a production email platform. So that's really the risk to be aware of. And you may decide that that risk is acceptable, given the benefits that you're getting in deploying on an unsupported platform. So just be aware of that, eyes wide open. That's what it really means when we're talking about supportability on these platforms. So this isn't for everyone. And this is the part where I want to be really, really, really clear. So very exciting that we're actually supporting this on Azure. It's very hard for me to be clear about how excited I am to actually be able to say we're done with this. We're good to go on Azure. Let's move forward. But from an Exchange perspective, your first and best option for Exchange in the cloud, and really from our perspective, your only option for Exchange in the cloud is Office 365 Exchange Online. Okay? You may also find, and we talked about cost briefly as well earlier, that an on-premises deployment may be a better alternative than deploying in the cloud. Now, the variables that go into that calculation are great. It's one of those things where it would be impossible for me in a session like this to actually go through all the different decision points and all the different math that would be involved in figuring that out for your particular scenario. It might actually be cheaper for a number of people in this room to deploy into Azure versus deploying on-prem. I can almost guarantee you, though, that it will be cheaper for you to deploy Exchange Online than either of those other two. So when you're having the cost discussion, keep that in mind. The reason that we're opening up support here is that we want you to have the deployment flexibility so that you don't get blocked by stupid, non-technical supportability statements, right? We did not support deployment on Azure for a very technical reason. We didn't have the storage performance, that was the last hurdle, to meet the requirements of the application. And now that we no longer have a technical reason for blocking support of that deployment, we want you to have that flexibility to be able to take advantage of the solution if it makes sense for you. So that's really why we're doing this. We want you to have that option. We've talked about this a bit in a number of sessions here, and we've been talking about this for a while. Office 365 is absolutely our focus. There are features coming to Office 365 and already in Office 365 that may not make it into the on-premises product because of the scope of the feature or the way it's designed. So when you think about our investments moving forward, Office 365 is where you are absolutely going to find them, where you're going to have the most complete experience with Exchange. When we think about deploying Exchange on Azure, deploying Exchange on any other similar provider, you're essentially getting the experience that you would have with an on-premises deployment. You're not deploying Office 365. So Exchange on Azure is not Exchange in the cloud from our perspective. Just be aware of that. That's the clarity that we wanted to bring home. So let's talk about some specific scenarios and then jump into the best practices content that we want to cover today. So dev and test. This is actually the scenario that I think there's no argument around. Makes huge amounts of sense for Exchange customers. How many of you actually run a lab that mirrors your production deployment? How many of you want to be able to run a lab that mirrors your production deployment so you can run those CUs that we're releasing and get a sense of quality before you actually go into production? Does that sound good? So doing that in an IaaS deployment is a very simple way to build lab infrastructure when you don't already have that physical or virtual capacity on premises already in order to be able to get a sense of how Exchange is going to perform. So you can very quickly spin up VMs. You can automate the entire process of building your lab with PowerShell. Some of the new functionality that's become available with Azure Resource Manager actually also helps in this space. And you can actually automate this to the point of being able to go gather information with PowerShell out of production in terms of the way your servers are deployed, named, configured, and in a sense mirror that into an IaaS deployment that's able to be spun up very quickly. So we absolutely love this. This is fantastic, makes complete sense. You can even do some interesting things like testing the DR behavior within the product, right? You could deploy multiple sites in Azure and bring links down between those sites and understand how the product's actually going to fail. Now, having said that, we also want you to validate site resilience and DR scenarios in production as well. That's a general best practice. You should always be testing those things before you actually need them. But this is an opportunity to try that out in a lab fairly easily. So what we're talking about there is basically taking your production topology or some small subset of it, mirroring it in a sense, and moving it out into Azure's cloud. So another frequent request that we get from customers is the ability to move all of their hybrid infrastructure into the cloud. Right? We're moving to Exchange Online, we're moving to Office 365, and for whatever reason, as a customer, I need to continue to have some on-premises servers to maintain a hybrid connection. Now, let's assume I'm not necessarily talking about having mailboxes in Azure or an IaaS provider here, right? I'm talking about having the Exchange hybrid role, right? There isn't really a hybrid role, but that Exchange server, typically a multi-role server, that's licensed as a hybrid server, in other words, it's free, that's managing that secure mail flow. Maybe you're doing this because you have line of business applications that need to be able to send mail to your users on Office 365, and you want that on-premises SMTP endpoint that will then handle that secure message traffic into Office 365. That's one potential possibility. Maybe you actually have mailboxes on premises, and you're fully hybrid, but you don't want to have that hybrid role infrastructure on-prem. We actually get that request fairly frequently. You can now do that in a supported way here. Just keep in mind that that you are running a production Exchange box in Azure, right? So wherever that transport database is, even if you have no mailboxes, you still have a transport database. That has to live on premium storage. That's key from a supportability perspective. So you now have the ability to essentially take that on-prem deployment and run that on IaaS virtual machines. Now we've had that ability to move ADFS up to Azure, to move DirSync, AAD sync, to move to extend AD into Azure to support directory synchronization. We've had that ability for quite some time. So this is really completing that. One other point that I'll call out, we do get complaints fairly frequently that in order to manage objects in Office 365, in order to manage the mail attributes, as an example, in a hybrid deployment, you really need to have an Exchange PowerShell endpoint to connect to, right? And because we don't have standalone admin tools anymore, right? Admin is through PowerShell. PowerShell is all remote PowerShell with Exchange 2013. You need to have Exchange CAS and Mailbox in order to make remote PowerShell work. So in order to have that administrative endpoint, you need to have full-blown Exchange sitting somewhere. Now you can put it in Azure, not have to worry about maintaining it on premises. That's another great potential use of this technology. Running a witness on an IaaS VM. This is something that we announced a few months ago. And out of curiosity, has anyone actually deployed this? This is using Azure as a third site. So we've got 1, 2. Well, okay, so Tim over there in the corner is actually the guy who did all the testing to make this supportable. So yes, we know you've done it, but 2 customers have done it. That's good to see. This is a very, so I don't want to say quick and easy. The slide says quick and easy, but I know better. This can actually get fairly complex, right? There are some specific networking requirements to make this happen. You need site-to-site VPN between your 2 Exchange on-premises sites and the Azure site that's hosting the file share witness. And we've actually even tried to do this within Microsoft IT and discovered all kinds of roadblocks into making that happen. So I understand that there can be some challenges getting this going, but having said that, this is way easier than going and breaking ground on a third data center somewhere in the world in order to support a file share witness for Exchange. It's important to call out here, this is not the Azure Cloud Witness feature. All right, Azure Cloud Witness is a specific Azure feature that's associated with a specific version of Windows that provides similar functionality. We don't support Azure Cloud Witness with Exchange. Now, we might at some point in the future, but at the moment, we do not. So don't get this confused with Azure Cloud Witness. You can't just go turn on Azure Cloud Witness and get this functionality behind the scenes. If you are interested in doing this, the aka.ms link that's on screen will give you more detail about what's required and how to get that up and running. But we really think that it's a great solution for getting essentially automatic failover during DR events with Exchange 2013. Stretching a DAG into IaaS is another interesting potential deployment option. So the scenario here is that you have a single site, and now you want to introduce site resilience with Exchange. You have no second site to put Exchange servers into. So let's use Azure for that. I want to caution you that while this can be done, this is going to be really, really tricky to get right. There's a number of reasons for it. And I'm not going to be able to cover all of them with the amount of time that I have to talk about it today. So you'll see more guidance on this particular topic from us over time. But keep in mind that in order to make this work, you need some very specific requirements around network bandwidth and latency between both sites. In order to get this to work, you're also likely going to be deploying a second site in Azure to be that third site for automatic failover, right? That can be hard to configure depending on how you're actually going to set up the connectivity between your on-premises deployment and Azure. And whether or not you use ExpressRoute in particular will come into play here. Your ability to essentially have multiple ExpressRoute links into specific Azure locations versus your ability to have multiple site-to-site VPN links, it starts to get very complex. I will say that if you go down this path, ExpressRoute is the way to go. The connectivity, reliability, bandwidth, basically the good feeling of working with your telco carrier to understand exactly what level of connectivity you're going to have into Azure is something that you really need if you want to deploy a stretched production DAG that's going to have machines running in Azure. The other challenge here, well, not the only one, but the other really big challenge here is that when you deploy a DAG, we really want your DAG to be deployed in a symmetric manner, right? And that's a preferred architecture statement that we've been making for quite some time. We want you to have the same number of servers in both sites. We want you to have the same number of databases. Basically, we want the database distribution to be spread out evenly. And you need to make sure that if you actually lose your primary site, that you have enough resources in your second site to be able to take that load. Or if you're running active-active, obviously you need that that level of performance as well. That basically implies that if you're going to use Azure for this, those VMs in Azure need to have essentially the same horsepower as the physical servers or VMs that you're deploying on premises today. Now, there's a limited set of SKUs that you can procure for those VMs. So maybe you're lucky. Maybe you're running VMs on-prem that are exactly the same from a CPU and memory configuration as the ones that we have available in Azure. Most likely, you're not lucky. So then you have to figure out, are you going to build new VMs, redesign things a bit, re-architect in order to meet those requirements. So just be aware that this is not an instant fix to go add a second site. You need to actually do some serious planning if you are interested in going down this path. Then you have the option of going all in. And that's just saying, I'm not going to run Exchange on my own premises anymore. I'm going to procure VMs in the cloud in Azure that we're talking about today, and I'm going to just deploy Exchange there and have that be the only location for Exchange. Now, as I mentioned before, we really want you to think about Office 365 first if you're going to go down this path. If there is a reason that you cannot deploy Office 365, if that doesn't make sense for your organization, then this certainly is an alternative. So, absolutely understand what you're going to get out of this, what you're not going to get out of this. You are outsourcing some of that infrastructure management, but you're still managing Exchange, and that actually may be a benefit to you. You may still want that level of control. But when you're doing the cost analysis, think through all that as you're going through that process. Just be aware. Much better from an Exchange perspective moving forward when you think about features, completeness, the overall experience, to be on Office 365. All right, enough with the supportability and discussion about different scenarios. Let's talk about the good stuff, the nitty-gritty. So planning is absolutely critical when you think about deploying on IaaS. I learned this the hard way when I started playing with Azure years ago. There's a certain order of operations. You kind of need to think through networking very early in the process as an example. If you start building a huge topology with 10, 20, 30 machines that are all going to be talking to each other in various ways and be routed in wonderful and mysterious ways, you really need to get all the networking config right first. Because depending on how you're setting things up, you may not be able to reverse some of those decisions later on without doing some rebuilding. So while it may make sense to go out and kick the tires, when you're actually going through the process of building out production, spend some time actually figuring out the right order of operations, build a checklist, go through that process very carefully. When we think about sizing, and I'm actually going to show you a demo of the sizing process for Azure in a minute or two, it's going to be very similar to the sizing process for Exchange on-prem. I was about to say Office 365. You don't have to size for Office 365. That's our problem. Well, you do for bandwidth, I guess. But for a virtualized deployment on premises, it's going to be extremely similar to that because at the end of the day, you're deploying onto Hyper-V VMs, essentially, in Azure, right? Hyper-V is the hypervisor, which is why we can support it. And so that little tick box in the calculator that says, am I virtualizing? The answer is yes. And we have built in our CPU adjustment for hypervisor-based deployments into the calculator by default if you select that checkbox. So remember that you are virtualizing on Hyper-V. Let's talk a little bit about namespace design. I'm actually going to step through a number of concepts that are taken directly out of the preferred architecture and try and map them onto an IaaS deployment. So when we think about namespace design with Exchange for an IaaS deployment, the preferred architecture recommends an unbound namespace. What that essentially means is I have multiple sites. My namespace is not bound to a particular site. So I might have a West Coast site and an East Coast site, and I have a single namespace that crosses both of them. Now I can direct traffic to that namespace in various ways, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But essentially the servers in those sites are responsible for figuring out where the traffic's going to go in order to service the need. One of the biggest pushbacks that we get on deploying in an unbound namespace is that there's all this proxy traffic between sites, right? Half of my traffic potentially is going to be going to the wrong site and then have to go over my internal network where I'm potentially limited on bandwidth in order to actually get to the appropriate destination. Well, if I deploy an IaaS, that's now Microsoft's problem in the case of Azure, right? You're now running across the Microsoft network that connects our data centers. Now, yes, there certainly are charges associated with network when it comes to egress traffic. It's absolutely true. But you don't need to worry about provisioning bandwidth. You don't have to guarantee that that bandwidth is going to be always available. Our networks are extraordinarily well designed. Extraordinarily well designed. And the amount of bandwidth that we have between our data centers is staggering. Ridiculous. So this is a case where IaaS actually kind of helps the preferred architecture. I don't think Ross would appreciate me saying that, but ignore all the fact that we talk about physical hardware only and some things that would be very unfriendly to this type of architecture. When we talk about namespace design, this is a case where we actually plug in really nicely to the preferred architecture. So you still have the option of doing a bound namespace if that makes sense for a particular business requirement, but unbound is absolutely possible and even easier with IaaS potentially than it would be otherwise. The preferred architecture talks about deploying multiple sites in multiple regions, essentially, spreading out the chance for some sort of natural disaster to impact Exchange. And in a physical deployment, you obviously are going to be responsible for figuring out how you get that data center space, whether that's that you're a large corporation and you have multiple locations in the US, maybe internationally. That's certainly one way to achieve that. You already have those sites and could take advantage of those for deployment. Or you need to go actually procure space in a data center somewhere to do that deployment. Obviously, with Azure, we're just talking about deployment regions. Bring up VMs in different deployment regions, you're done. So this is another example of a case where we actually fit in very nicely with the preferred architecture. 2 or more well-connected data centers. Azure definitely has 2 or more well-connected data centers. We can check that box pretty easily. Now, when we talk about server design, that's where things start to get a little hairier, a little more interesting. So I mentioned earlier that we have a limited set of virtual machine sizes. There's actually a very specific set of virtual machine sizes in Azure that are acceptable for use because of the premium storage requirement. That's the DS set of SKUs. I'll show you what those look like in just a second. You'll still be in the sizing process figuring out what resources you need to get out of those servers. Right? The calculator, the role requirements calculator, is going to help you figure out how many machines of what size you need. Now, because you have these set SKU sizes coming from your provider, it's a little bit different than going to HP or Dell or whoever and saying, yeah, I need 40 2U servers that are configured with this specific amount of RAM and this specific set of processors, right? A little less flexibility from a sizing perspective. But all that means is you need to be a little bit creative about how you're going to take advantage or how you're going to map resource requirements onto the set of SKUs that are available. Now, the preferred architecture specifies JBOD storage. And what we're talking about when we say JBOD is literally just a bunch of disks presented through a controller with some caching on it and no RAID. Now, depending on the controller, that may mean individual drives that are presented as RAID 0. But we still consider that JBOD, to be clear. But no RAID behind the scenes, right? Exchange is going to manage data availability, data replication to make sure that if we lose drives, it's no problem, right? We expect that, we recover from it, no biggie. And we do that in order to help keep cost of the solution as low as possible. Now, obviously you can't get JBOD storage from the Azure Premium Storage offering. That would be entertaining. What you're going to get is actually really high-end storage that's able to do tens of thousands of IOPS in some cases and sustain really large amounts of storage bandwidth between the host and the storage backend. Now, we're still going to recommend that you look at that in the same way that you would look at JBOD drives for Exchange, for an Exchange physical deployment. I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. We also recommend sticking to a maximum size on these machines. Now, this is actually not, excuse me, not an issue for deployment on IaaS providers today, because the maximum sizes that are available are in no way larger than what our maximum scalability guidance is. This could become a problem in the future, but in general, just if VM sizes get really ridiculously huge, our scalability guidance still applies, so don't go wild. Deploying Exchange Server VMs is actually fairly straightforward in these types of deployments. Obviously, use static IPs. You're going to use static IPs for everything that you possibly can, because this is production, right? You're hopefully doing that anyway. Now, static IPs are really configured in Azure in a slightly different way. You're essentially reserving an IP for these VMs, an internal IP, that the VMs are effectively getting via DHCP. So think of it more like a DHCP reservation from a configuration perspective. But the key point is IPs aren't changing. This is really important for AD, and I have that on a slide in a moment, when we think about deploying DNS internally in order to get your AD connectivity up and running. But do this for Exchange as well, just a good best practice. Use Azure availability sets as well. This is a good high availability practice. Availability sets are essentially let's call them a clue to the Azure Fabric about which machines are related, such that when Azure does maintenance, they can do the right thing and not bring down the entire deployment simultaneously. It's a great way to maintain the best availability possible with Exchange. We don't support sysprep. I don't think Exchange has ever supported sysprep. I've been working with Exchange since the 2000 release. I don't know if we did prior, but I don't know that sysprep was in existence prior. But we don't support it today. We don't have any plans to support it. And what that means is that if you want to build like a template VM, like you might see with SQL, some of the other server products that are available in the library of VMs that you can build out quickly, Exchange isn't going to fit into that model. The reason we don't support sysprep is that when you run Exchange setup, it's dropping binaries on the box, and it's also performing configuration in Active Directory. Right? There's two things going on there. It's that configuration and AD part that causes us issues. We can't run through setup, expect that everything's been configured, and then consider that to be a template that you can then rinse and repeat. Right? So the recommendation here, download the latest CU on the box, just run the installation when you actually are ready for deployment. And we actually, so I'll be publishing a PowerShell sample, and this will also show up in a Azure Resource Manager template shortly, where we actually just go to a particular location on the download center, download the latest CU. At the moment, we don't have any way to detect specifically what that latest CU is, but we're working on that, and then execute that in an unattended manner. That actually works beautifully. So thinking about DAG design. So the recommended DAG design in the preferred architecture, if you just read the text of it, can be implemented pretty much word for word in IaaS with no issues. One of the key points in the preferred architecture around DAG design is around network simplicity. We really want you to consider using single network interfaces with Exchange 2013 servers. This is great for Azure, because on the set of VMs, VM types that we're talking about, we have a grand total of one network interface. It's our only option. So This is yet another example of a place where an IaaS deployment actually really maps nicely with the preferred architecture. You're going to have to use the IP-less DAG option, the DAG without cluster administrative access point feature that we made available a while back, because you don't have the ability to configure multiple IP addresses on these machines. So that's a case where a change in Exchange also helped to enable this scenario. We also really are going to recommend utilizing native data protection in Exchange. What I mean there is not running traditional backups. There's going to be enough, if you follow our guidance, you're going to have enough copies of your data across these Exchange servers to not have to worry about traditional backups. And running traditional backups in an IaaS provider can be a little challenging. So it's potentially nice to not have to worry so much about that. And that's all I'll say about DAG design for now. So let's talk briefly about sizing. So I mentioned we're going to use the on-premises virtualized methodology for sizing Exchange 2013. What does that mean? That means we start with the calculator, right? That's where we always start when we're sizing Exchange. Thank you, Ross, for creating the calculator. The calculator is just going to take our business requirements, turn them into infrastructure requirements, and from there we can move on to mapping those out onto the SKUs that are available. Or in this particular example, you can go from being an IT guy in red tights who apparently can't fly to being a guy in gray tights and orange shoes who can fly. And clearly that's better. So use the calculator. That's the key. So this is a list of the configuration of the DS series of virtual machines that you can deploy on Azure today. Now, I highlighted a couple of them in red, specifically in the memory column, because those ones don't meet our minimum memory requirements for Exchange. So wouldn't be supported to deploy on those sizes. But anything below that, so DS3 and above, you're golden. You're good to go. Now, when you look at the CPU core count and the memory sizes, some of these are going to make more or less sense for Exchange. I wouldn't deploy an Exchange server in production on a, no, we're good. I wouldn't deploy an Exchange production server on a machine on a VM with 2 CPU cores. If I had the option at a fairly minimal cost difference of deploying on something larger. And we go all the way up to 16 CPU cores, which is in line with some of the essentially commodity server hardware that we recommend with the preferred architecture. And the memory size is also very much in line with that. We talk about 20-ish cores and 96 gigs of RAM being sort of the sweet spot. So that 16 cores and 112 gigs of RAM, pretty darn close, right? You'll notice where it talks about max disk IOPS and bandwidth, that those numbers are just ridiculous for Exchange in general. It's just calling out that there's lots of storage horsepower behind the scenes. Now, in the Exchange sizing process, we always have to worry about megacycles, right? We use megacycles to calculate how much CPU horsepower we need on the servers that we're deploying onto. In order to do that, you need to know what the CPU spec is behind the scenes on those servers. Well, you can figure out what CPUs are actually being run by deploying one of these machines, popping open MS-Info32 and looking at the model number of the CPU. We actually did that on a set of these machines just to make sure that they were consistent. So this is what they're currently deployed with. This may not be the case moving forward, and likely won't, because much like Exchange, we are constantly reevaluating hardware SKUs and deploying new things on different hardware. So this is going to be an estimate, essentially. There's a little bit of guesswork that comes into play here, and you may want to artificially increase your CPU requirements in order to make sure that you have a little extra headroom when you're going through the sizing process here. That would be kind of a best practice for me when you think about this. But looking at the CPUs that are out there currently, the spec-int rate value that we would use is 42 per core for the CPUs that are deployed today for these SKUs. Important to call out max data disks and the disk size. So these are the premium storage disks that you're going to attach to these machines. There's a maximum number of them specific to each SKU, and the limit for each one of those is a terabyte. So you're not going to be deploying 8 terabyte disks, right? They're going to be limited to a terabyte. So real quick, let's jump over to my laptop. This will be a very quick demo, because really the only point that I want to drill home, well, first of all, there's 2 points. So, introducing the Exchange 2013 Server Role Requirements Calculator for Azure Cloud Edition Express. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. There is no calculator for this. It is literally just the normal calculator. So, I've actually highlighted in Azure Blue the items that I would change if I were going out to size an Azure deployment. So first one that I've got here, server role virtualization, yes, right? Absolutely. In this case, I'm actually going to size for a fairly small deployment. Frankly, we think that the sweet spot for this type of deployment is going to be a fairly small deployment. So I'm going to look at a site-resilient deployment, 2 sites, 2 servers, multi-role servers per site, configured within 1 database availability group. When I scroll down here into the user mailbox config, I'm sizing for 1,500 users with the 200 message profile and a 1 gig mailbox. Scroll down a little bit more. In general, I'm just using the defaults here, right? Now, because my data disks are going to be limited to 1 terabyte, I have to choose my 1 terabyte drives. Haven't seen 1 terabyte hard disks in a while. So this is a little different for Exchange folks who've been using the calculator recently. And then if we scroll down and look at server config, right, we're estimating kind of an initial guess of the hardware that we want to use, and then we can go tweak that later. I'm going to start with a server SKU that has 8 CPU cores available to it, and I mentioned that I provided the spec-int value earlier. This is literally 8 times the spec-int value, the per core spec-int value that we had.
Is the spec-int rate you used above or below the baseline?
Question was, is the spec-int rate that we used above or below the baseline? Off the top of my head, it's above, but it shouldn't matter from a. I'd be interested in why you asked the question. So we should talk later. And then I believe, yep, that was essentially all I added. So I did select an active-active solution. So I'm going to have both sites active with those 1,500 users spread out between them. So if I go look at the role requirements, with that server configuration, if I zoom in here a little bit, I'm basically going to require 48 gigs of memory on those machines. I'm going to run in a failure scenario, I'm going to run at 60% CPU. And so I consider myself to be fairly good to go. From a storage perspective, the calculator is going to require 5 data volumes, 5 data disks, and I'm going to be spreading out 20 database copies in the DAG across those 5 volumes, so 4 database copies per volume. So fairly straightforward type of deployment. So let me jump back to slides. All right. So Active Directory recommendations. We absolutely recommend using Windows Server 2012 or later. This is actually a generic recommendation for virtualizing domain controllers. There were some functionality changes made, or there was a feature added essentially for AD in Server 2012 that prevents rollback. And this is extremely important for any of you who have gone through the process of virtualizing your domain controllers. You know how dangerous rollback can be. So this is a good way to avoid that as a potential problem. Exchange uses AD sites for all sorts of things, right? We use it for mail routing. We use it for determining which domain controllers we should access for performance reasons. We use it for a number of operations related to failovers when it comes to site resilience. So we recommend absolutely mapping regions that you're deploying into to AD sites. fairly straightforward, makes sense, shouldn't be that big of a surprise. Typically, you'll be extending your existing AD infrastructure into Azure. So you'll have existing on-prem domain controllers, and you would be adding domain controller VMs in Azure local to those Exchange servers. In order to do that, you're going to need to have some pathways for replication. You're looking at either site-to-site VPN to make that happen or ExpressRoute. Once again, if you're doing a production deployment in Azure, you should really be looking at ExpressRoute. It's a smart thing to do to guarantee that that connectivity is going to meet your needs. In terms of network architecture, you're going to have to do some planning here. You're going to have to plan out virtual networks per region. You're going to have to plan out subnetting for those virtual networks. Essentially, the process that you would go through if you were going to go open a new data center in a new region and get a network deployed in it. When you're deploying multiple Azure regions and wanting to connect them, you're going to be using site-to-site VPN in Azure to make those connections happen. So just be aware of that. There's no implication to that, but that's essentially the process that you're going to go through within Azure to get that up and running. So if you're familiar with site-to-site VPN for your local on-premises data center and connecting to Azure, it's a similar process to get that going. And then load balancing is actually another case where Azure maps really nicely into the preferred architecture. So we did a bunch of work in 2013 to work better with load balancers that don't have a heck of a lot of intelligence, right? Dumb layer 4 load balancing is really what we like if we can get away with it, right? We still have the ability to do layer 7 load balancing, and there are some reasons for doing that in some specific cases, but the load balancing functionality that exists in Azure can work very nicely with Exchange. There is it's essentially a fairly, I don't really want to use the word dumb, but a fairly low feature set load balancer available in Azure that you can utilize for Exchange. It will do something similar to round-robin distribution. It's actually not truly round-robin. It's using a hash algorithm to figure out which server will be the destination for a given connection. But it's doing a nice job of spreading connections out without session affinity, which is really the key for Exchange. We don't want session affinity when hitting those CAS endpoints with very little configuration to get this up and running. It's just essentially built in. You're going and configuring endpoints for load balancing. If you need more functionality from your load balancer, you can also run virtual load balancer appliances. As an example, our friends at Kemp have an option that works really nicely in this space and take full advantage of the additional features in that stack from the virtual load balancer. Transport I mentioned already briefly, but I want to drill down into it for a second. So IaaS providers are typically not worried about IP reputation. And what I mean by IP reputation is how likely it is that a message coming or originating from a particular IP address is going to be spam. As email administrators, we have to think about IP reputation all the time. And as someone involved in running Exchange Online and Exchange Online protection, I can tell you that we think about it constantly. We do a huge amount of work to improve, if not hold steady, on the reputation of the IP addresses that are used for originating traffic in EOP. Now, we do that in a number of different ways, some of which we talk about publicly, some we don't. But when you think about Azure VMs, it's a different workload. It's essentially not specific to mail, and in many ways wasn't designed to handle mail. So those IP addresses that are going to be used for originating that outbound message traffic are not in any way managed by Microsoft, shall we say, for reputation. Additionally, it's going to be a challenge for you as a potential consumer of one of those IP addresses to constantly fight to keep that IP address off of block lists. Because in many cases, those block lists are actually ranges, like the entire range of addresses consumed by Azure. So it's going to be you trying to get a single IP address removed from that. There's a way around this, though. And the best practice here is go look at options for routing your traffic through an outbound relay service. One of which is provided by Microsoft. You can use EOP for this, right? You can perform certificate authentication against EOP on an outbound connector and use EOP standalone, essentially, to handle delivery of your mail. Really important to understand that if you're going to deploy into Azure and actually send out bulk mail, we will notice in EOP and prevent that. We have ways to keep an eye on that and prevent it. So don't, this is not an opportunity for abuse, but be aware that EOP is an option for this, and there are other third parties out there as well that will take your outbound mail and deliver it. We actually, until recently, were not able to do this with EOP. We did not, so we actually recognized in EOP that an incoming connection was from Azure or another IaaS provider, any other IaaS provider or any IP on a certain block list. And as a result of seeing that, didn't even advertise the start TLS verb, the ability to initiate a secure connection with a certificate. There were a number of reasons we did that, but we've recently reversed that and enabled this particular scenario by allowing cert auth to Azure VMs. So that's an option. So coming to the end here, does this stuff actually work? Yet another one of my favorite graphics from the new graphics library. Well, let's take a look. And then we're gonna close out with a couple of questions here. Okay. All right. Let's close up the calculator. So I showed a sizing example for a fairly straightforward database availability group. I actually skipped over the fact that I was picking 3 copies plus a lag. I didn't mention that, but that was used in that example. That was using 4 servers, 2 in each region. So if we go think about how we might actually deploy that in Azure, it might look something like this. Looking at something sort of like the namespace design slide that I showed previously. So we have our friend Sue sitting somewhere in North America once again, as she always is. And she's part of the Contoso organization. And in this particular case, I'm going to go deploy mail servers for the Contoso organization in a West region data center and an East region data center. And I'm going to deploy a file share witness in a Central region data center. I'm going to expose 2 VIPs, 2 load balanced virtual IPs with particular namespaces, C-W-EX, so that's Contoso West, C-E-EX, Contoso East Exchange, .cloudapp.net. It's the Cloud App namespace that you get with Azure. And then if I just follow the preferred architecture, I could then use the IP addresses associated with those VIPs, round robin between them in DNS, and expose that as mail.contoso.com. And that's effectively what I'm doing right here. So if I go to mail.contoso.com/OA, and I go log in, you'll notice this is nice and snappy. Awesome. See, it really does work. Let's try this again. All right, so that should look very familiar to all of you. This is Exchange 2013 CU8. All right, nice and snappy. This happens to be running on the DS13 SKU, I believe. So I got a message from my coworker, Greg Taylor, who actually is advising me I should probably get Brian Day to update our special website, which is a very good idea. I'll just mention briefly that we have a website that we created because we the customer adoption team, we're constantly getting questions from our internal field about whether or not this type of deployment on Azure was supported with Exchange. So Brian went out and registered, is Exchange supported on Azure.com, that we could use as a reply to those emails. And what you see here is what that website showed. So I'll go ahead and let Greg know that I already talked to him, and we are good to go. Send. All right, so OA is working beautifully on Azure, and is Exchange supported on Azure.com? Says, yep. So behind the scenes, I've got Remote Desktop Connection Manager here. I have all my VMs available to me. Exchange PowerShell, as we all know and love, with my database copy. My database copy is available here to check status on. And this is exactly the same as any on-premises deployment that you might deploy. I have 2 AD servers in each of the 2 sites running Exchange. In this excuse me, in this case, in the central site where I'm running my file share witness, I have a single DC. We don't recommend running file share witness on a DC. There's some security implications to that are detailed in the documentation for Cloud File Share Witness for us. So I separated out AD and the file share witness into separate VMs there. But this is a fully working Exchange topology. Mailflow works beautifully, and we are good to go. So yes, it absolutely does actually work. So with that, Exchange on IaaS is absolutely possible. Awesome. Very happy to be up on stage saying that. This is a nice chapter to be able to close and provide that deployment option to all of you. Absolutely consider all your options. Office 365 should still be front and center when you're thinking through your deployment choices. And make sure that you stay within supportability boundaries. There are ways to step outside of those. And I mentioned essentially what the implication is. Just go into that eyes wide open. My email address is up on screen. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to continue the conversation. If you have questions that we can't get to today, I'm more than happy to do that. And real quick, before I take a couple of questions, I did want to point out that if you're interested in getting involved in Exchange or SharePoint pre-release programs, we do have opportunities to get involved in those if you're not already. My friend Kern is here in the back in an orange shirt, and he is the guy to talk to if you're interested in signing up for one of those programs. Or if you don't want to do that right now, we also have a booth down on the expo floor where you can go sign up. So with that, I will take questions. Please evaluate the session. Really appreciate that, and thanks for being here today.